To the battlefield in Ukraine, where Kyiv's troops are fighting to contain recent Russian advances and prevent more territory losses. Short on air defences and waiting for more Western military support, Ukraine is turning to improvised weapons for the front line. DW's Nick Connolly met soldiers using agricultural drones to make up for missing firepower.
You have to get a feel for it. Flying this thing is like leading a cow over ice. It's heavy. You have to be able to predict where it's going to go. You steer it one direction, but the inertia means it's still going the other way for a while.
This drone was built to spray crops. It's noisy, slow, and impossible to miss in daylight. But here on the front lines, it flies at night, harassing Russian positions. Russian soldiers have their own name for it, Baba Yaga, after the flying witch of Slavic folktales.
We fly pretty low and can go up to 20 kilometers. Our job is to contain the enemy, to make sure their infantry doesn't get anywhere near our infantry.
That's a sound these men says allows them to relax. It's outgoing Ukrainian artillery fire. Delayed Western supplies have meant that most of the fire around here in recent months has been incoming. These drones were all the Ukrainian side had. This garage is where the unit's engineer tries to keep one step ahead of Russia's jamming efforts.
Our biggest worry is staying connected to the drones. The government gives us these drones and they just use one frequency for everything. Video and telemetrics. It's a mess. They've given us a civilian product. It just doesn't work under real-life conditions.
Here, within earshot of the front lines, the unit's engineer adds antennas and extra equipment paid for by crowdfunding. The owners of this garage have long since evacuated, leaving their tools behind.
This is the toolkit that's come with me since I was called up. I don't touch the owner's stuff. I think I borrowed the grinder in here a few times, but we leave things tidy when we leave a place. The cats are always fatter when we leave a place.
At the moment, there's no talk of having to leave this garage, or even to pull back here. For all of Russia's recent advances near Donetsk, this section of the front lines has been relatively stable, thanks in part to these drones. Here, deep underground, is where all the information comes together. Dispatchers help the drone pilots out in the field to plan their routes. Something that's constantly getting harder, with ever more drones in the air watching each other.
Just the other day, we were watching the stream and saw a kamikaze drone chasing another kamikaze drone. All of a sudden, a third drone turns up to attack the drone hunting the first drone. All I could think of was the soundtrack from Terminator 2. Sometimes it feels like the war of the machines here.
But it's not just the technology that's changing.
When we first came across the Russian army, they didn't have a clue about war. They were really full of themselves. They would always use the same tactics, which we knew from A to Z. It was easy to catch them out with a bit of creativity. But as time passes, there are more and more mobilized civilians among their ranks, and they bring their own ideas to the Russian army.
Not only are these Russian conscripts bringing their own ideas, they're also successfully copying Ukrainian ones. And they're doing it at a scale that Ukraine is struggling to match.
And DW's Max Zander joins us for more on this story from Kyiv. How effective are these converted drones?
Right, Ben. So when over the last 2 years, drones have really changed the way this war is being fought, really changed the situation on the battlefield. We heard in the report in the beginning of this war, standard tactics were being applied, standard weapons were being used, such as infantry, artillery, tanks, that sort of thing. When drones were being introduced, this added an extra layer. Cheap, commercially available drones were able to spot the enemy, pinpoint targets for artillery, for example. Later on, combat drones, like the one we just saw in Nick's report, were introduced. They're becoming more and more widespread. According to the Ukraine General Staff, up to 70% of Russian equipment now is being destroyed by these kind of drones. And they really are able to change and limit the movement of the adversary, being it Ukrainian or being it Russian. If you're moving, especially in an open terrain during the day, you really risk being spotted or being targeted by drones or by other troops that are using this type of information. So movement is really limited, and cover and concealment is becoming more and more important, especially in the open field.
To what extent would you say they can make up for the slow supply of Western weapons?
Right. I mean, these drones were born out of necessity, in a sense that there was a lack of powerful or Western weapons in this case. But these drones do have some advantages. They can be operated from the rear. They can support infantry. They have a relatively wide reach, and they are also able to effectively support infantry troops, for example. And they are very cheap. I mean, we saw like a lot of these drones are crowdfunded. They're being put together by volunteers, by the military in sheds and in workplaces, by different startup companies. But they're having an effect on the battlefield for sure, but in order to deoccupy parts of Ukraine, in order to move fortificated front lines, drones will not be enough. In order to be able to do that, you will need combined weapons. You will need heavy weapons, you will need artillery, you will need air superiority, you will need tanks, boots on the ground. Drones will definitely have their place in this. If we see more Western weapons coming in, then likely the use of drones is going to go down. But so far they are playing a very important role in this war for now.
You mentioned earlier how drones are changing warfare, but tell us more about how it's actually changing how combat is carried out.
Right. I mean, you have drones that are being used by the infantry, such as first-person view drones, suicide or kamikaze drones. You have more sophisticated drones, loitering ammunition that is being launched by either side, that circles an area, and that is able to, by itself, search for enemy vehicles, for example, and attack them. In addition to that, when we talk about drone attacks here in Ukraine, oftentimes we're talking about Shahed drones, loitering munition that is started in large swarms, for example, from Crimea to attack cities across the entire country here in Ukraine. Ukraine is also using these types of drones to attack targets in Russia, for example, oil refineries across the country as far as St. Petersburg, for example. And in addition to that, what I think is also very remarkable, the use of drones in this war, is how they're being used not in the air, but in the sea. If you remember, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the port of Odessa was blocked by the Russian Navy. The Ukrainians, without having a fleet of their own, were able to push the second largest navy in the world out of the western part of the Black Sea by using sea drones, essentially jet skis with remote controls, cameras, and a big bomb. A little bit more sophisticated about that, but we're able to sink ships and push the Russian Navy away from their ports, from their western coastline.
Some really interesting details there from Max Zander. And Keith, thanks for joining us.